I guess with Empyrion and Space Engineers being pretty much the only well-developed space building survival sandbox out there, I think it's interesting to point out how different mechanics and directions in the game contributes to how different the ships are made in those games, with my ships as examples. So because I play both games, I often develop my ships in parallel to each other on both games. So when I play Space Engineers, I sometimes make similar ships on Empyrion, and when I play Empyrion, I sometimes make similar ships on Space Engineers. And while my general shipbuilding philosophy is pretty much the same, the appearance is pretty much where the similarity ends. And note that both ships were made for the vanilla official servers on each game. Alright, so the first difference you might notice is that my Empyrean ship has a rather noticeable side armor. And this is because in Empyrean, it's much harder to dodge bullets or projectiles. While on Space Engineers, especially on PvP, dodging guns is pretty much the norm or normal practice for PvP. While on Empyrean, there's a lot more emphasis on defense because, like I said before, the guns are much harder to dodge, and not to mention there are homing weapons on Empyrean by default. Now, the second difference that you might notice is that my Empyrean ship is bigger, much bigger. This is because on Empyrean, while there are limitations still, the limitations are usually much higher and less restrictive compared to Space Engineers. This is because there are less physics simulations on Empyrean, so they are able to have the limitations set very high in general, resulting in people being able to build much bigger ships in general. The third difference is that in Empyrean, you don't need physical connection to most things, while on Space Engineers, you need actual conveyor connection for most things. This results in very different designs depending on the uses, because on Empyrean, there's this Wi-Fi material transfer technology since it's a more sci-fi game, while Space Engineers is a more down-to-earth, grounded on realism game. My Empyrean ship also has more rooms and living areas, and this is because there are more emphasis on survival elements on Empyrean. While on Space Engineers, you only need oxygen and energy to survive. On Empyrean, there's a lot more things. For example, on Space Engineers, I have a bed and some decorative kitchens, usually. While on Empyrean, I have actual crew quarters, medical facility, functional kitchen, farm area, and a lot more things. And this is still very Spartan in Empyrean standard, but my Space Engineer ships are definitely more Spartan in this regard because of those different gameplay elements. So in Space Engineers, I focus more on function like engineering, while on Empyrean, I'm more free to explore survival areas of ship. When things get destroyed on Space Engineers, things can fly around, and your ship design need to account for this. And not so much on Empyrean. On Empyrean, because of the sci-fi nature, there's anti-gravity technology, so when your ship parts get disconnected, they don't fly around. And that's why there's more emphasis on keeping the ship safe in case of a disconnect on my Space Engineer ships compared to my Empyrean ships. But that doesn't mean Empyrean doesn't have an advantage in terms of realism. So when the thrusters are turned on, they produce heat and radiation. And it's also the case with many other parts. So this is something that you need to think about when you design your ships on Empyrean. Like, you cannot just put a thruster on a living area or a walkway, because when you walk on them, they might burn you or give you radiation. So it's important to point out that on Empyrean, you cannot walk on your ships while they are moving, while on Space Engineers you can do this. So yeah, I think it's interesting to point out how different things are on Space Engineers and Empyrean, especially for those of you who wants to know the difference. Alright, so those are the difference between my Space Engineer ships and my Empyrean ships.